G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and au revoir, Monsieur Trudeau. This weekend, Justin Trudeau ends his 12 years as the leader of the Liberal Party in Canada and almost a decade as its Prime Minister. He said he was going to resign, and this weekend is the weekend when Liberal Party members will go to the polls and select his replacement. Who exactly is running to replace him? What do they believe? And how will they fare in a face-off against the Canadian Conservatives, which will subsequently take place? A lot of Canadians are frustrated and exhausted and exasperated that this political circus and election malarkey is coming at precisely the moment when their closest ally and neighbour, the United States, is launching an unprecedented trade war against them, and they're all scratching their heads, sort of having to rethink and reevaluate their economic future and their strategic future. It's an extraordinary time in Canada, so I wanted to understand it and see if it has any lessons for all of the rest of us and understand the Canadian point of view on Donald Trump and his tariffs and his trade war. Jen Gerson is the ideal person to speak to. She's an absolute delight. She has written for the New York Times and the Washington Post and The Economist. She previously worked for the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail and the National Post, but now she is a freelance writer, and she has co-founded a Substack called The Line, which is a Canadian commentary website and podcast. It is fabulous. She is fabulous. I hope you enjoy as much as I did. The one and only Jen Gerson.
I think it's a straightforward sigh of relief about what we would call the identitarian politics or the woke left, the breaking of the hold of that kind of cultural, the hold of that whole cultural milieu on, for lack of a term, elite thought or intellectual thought. And there's a lot of emotional resonance that goes along with that. The problem is that, of course, in a desire to let go of one illiberal impulse, these people are aligning themselves with a team that's arguably worse.
Yeah.
And more liberal. And I think it's pretty hard for a Canadian conservative not to see that, because, like, as I said, his version of America First doesn't include us yet anyway. So, like, we're not American. So therefore, that's like, great. You got rid of woke, you got rid of DEI. Congratulations. Like, those were problematic. Now you have something that wants to crush you personally in your homes. Super then. Right. Anyway, we can get into it, but
it's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know what to make of it. I don't really understand. I don't really remember anymore why people were so agitated about wokeness. I mean, I do, of course. It's fucking irritating. It's annoying. But, like,
I think that's probably also because I don't think it took hold in Australia in the same way that it did in North America.
Maybe. I
don't think that. Now, I don't know, because I'm not in Australia, obviously. But the degree to which it essentially consumed a huge chunk of the cultural power structure and the cultural zeitgeist for years. I mean, there's a bit of I would say, a kind of post hoc gaslighting that's happening, that's saying, oh, this was always a minor fringe thing. It's bullshit. It wasn't a minor fringe thing. It was an absolutely mainstream thing. And particularly in places like Canada, which were already very progressive compared to a lot of places in the United States, it was all consuming for a few years there. It was totally all consuming. So the backlash that's happening is totally understandable to me. It was one thing that I think my co-founder and I, Matt, were warning about for the last 5 years. We're like, guys, the backlash to this is coming, and it's come, and it's now gone. And now what we've embraced what people are embracing in order to try and steer away from some of the extreme left positions that they had adopted and that the culture had adopted in recent years, is an extreme right position, or right in scare quotes, because I'm not sure it's conservative in any meaningful sense, but it's a populist, authoritarian, illiberal backlash. That's what's happening. And it's just as scary as some of the extreme stuff on the far left, if not worse. In fact,
is that manifesting itself in Canada, Jen?
Not the same way. I don't think it's the same way. I mean, we can talk about the Canadian conservative movement and my issues.
Let's talk about it. Let's talk
it.
about it because I won't do an intro here, so we can just. I mean, I'll probably use this if that's okay with you. It's interesting.
Sure. I mean,
So yeah,
if you want, we can go. Like, I'm not giving you much of a lead into a lot of the thoughts on these
no, that's
particular
okay.
ideas,
We'll
but
get there.
okay.
So yeah, just finish that thought. How is that backlash against the sort of hegemony or dominance of cultural leftism manifesting itself in Canada at the moment?
Well, look, I mean, I would say up until recently, there was a kind of a Canadian MAGA crowd, sort of a crowd of people who got very pro-Trump. And I don't think they encompass the entirety of the conservative base or anything like that. But there was an aspect of the conservative base that was kind of pro-Trump, pro-MAGA. Good on him. Thank God we got this guy, this ballsy guy coming out there, blowing stuff up, saying the things that need to be said, breaking the hold of the cultural elites, breaking the hold of this woke politics, that kind of vibe. And I mean, my co-founder Matt and I have never been Trumpers. We've never been MAGA people, and we've always been deeply skeptical of the Trump phenomenon because fundamentally we saw in it the same, if not worse, liberal tendencies to what we were concerned about from the sort of extreme left side as well, right? So we were always kind of these pokey, annoying centrists who could never make friends because we were like, yeah, no, we actually kind of believe in basic liberal values, like free speech is kind of a good thing, and we were uncomfortable with coding that value as a right-wing value because we thought that once the right wing inevitably gained power, they would weaponize it, and it's what they're doing. But so anyway, there was always, I think, a contingency of Canadian conservatives who were so fed up with what you would call wokeism, or what I would kind of call in a more neutral way identitarian leftist politics, that they saw Trump as like a breaking of the hold of that politics over the culture. And they cheered it on. They were emotionally relieved and gratified when someone like Trump came forward and just blew all that apart. The concern that I had, and that Matt had, and that we both had, was that when Trump starts talking about America first, like, dude, he's not talking about you. You're a Canadian. You're a foreigner. To Americans, foreigners aren't real. We're like birds, man. Like we're holographs in the sky. So when Donald Trump comes in and says America first, and we're going to make America great again, and he's talking about this in a zero-sum game, he means he's going to do it at your expense. And he doesn't care if you're a left-wing Canadian or a right-wing Canadian. You're all non-people to him. So
right, but is the Canadian to the Canadians who have an affinity for Donald Trump or who admire him, is it that they want him to be the president of the United States and they think that's going to be good for Canada, or is it that they find his style of opposition to wokeness refreshing enough that they would like to replicate it in Canada?
I think it's more the left. I think the latter, not the former. I don't think that there was any particular illusion that he was going to be great for Canada. I think they underestimated the degree to which he was going to be a potentially huge economic problem for Canada. They underestimated the risk he represented hugely. We had a leader, Doug Ford, who's the Premier of Ontario, recently been reelected the Premier of Ontario, and he just came out of a successful election campaign. And one of the opposition drops that landed on him was this clip of him saying, and I'm going to paraphrase here, not a direct quote, but he was asked to respond in a private conversation to how he felt about Donald Trump. And he was like, something to the effect of, oh yeah, I was so happy that he got elected until he stabbed us in the gut. Right. So I think there's a contingency of Canadian conservatives that feel, I was on your side, man, emotionally, and then you turned around on us.
And wait, was this opposition research against the Premier on the basis of the fact that because it was damaging that he liked Trump, or damaging that he said that Trump stabbed him in the gut?
No, it was damaging that he liked Trump.
Okay, right.
Because remember what's happened since Trump's been elected, and Trump started musing about Canada becoming a 51st state and talking about bringing these really catastrophic tariffs on us, which he's now done. Is that there has been an enormous sort of gathering of national unity and national pride around essentially screw these guys. Like there's a sense of just genuine and I think quite personal betrayal that the Americans are doing this to us, because for 80 plus years, we've been the closest of friends, the closest of allies, and our economic integration has only grown tighter over time. So we've become interdependent. But of course, it's an interdependency in which they hold the bulk of the leverage, just because they're economically and demographically so much larger than us. And we've built our entire society really around this assumption of friendship and interdependence with the United States and its economy. And so to have them elect someone who turns around and says, no, fuck you, and we're going to screw over your auto sector, we're going to tariff you to the hilt, we see you as an enemy of our economic interests. Not only does that potentially make, represent a real significant impact on my quality of life and the quality of life of my family, and that one that will hurt me in the grocery stores and the bills that I pay and the clothes that I buy and everything I do. So not only does that have a material impact on me, but there's a real sense of emotional betrayal, like a genuine sense of, if China had screwed us over, that's one thing. Like, China's not our brother, not our friend, but like, imagine you being betrayed by your best friend or being betrayed by a lover. Like, it's that kind of a thing. It's like these people were supposed to be our, if not our brothers, our cousins. We were so culturally similar. We consume the same media. We speak the same way. We have many of the same values. I mean, Canadians are a little bit inflected to the left of Americans on a lot of cultural issues. And so there are some differences. But the differences were never that stark. And to be screwed over by people with whom you have such a long and historic relationship with is a real emotional blow. And I think it's just forcing Canadians to have a total existential conversation with themselves about what the hell we're doing here. And whether or not we allowed ourselves to become way too dependent on the Americans economically and maybe culturally as well.
When you say that there's a sense that you've been screwed over by people who you trusted, is there a way to separate the American people from the leadership? I mean, is there a segment of Canada that is able to say, well, Trump is this kind of sui generis thing, and
but they elected him. They elected him. It's not like he didn't come to power in a military coup. Right. And so I'm not going to speak for all Canadians, because all Canadians, like, everybody's emotional spaces are different here. But I can tell you there are Canadians now who feel very icky about traveling to the States on vacation, which they wouldn't have done 6 months ago.
Yeah.
I can tell you that there are real, I think largely symbolic boycott campaigns where it's like, we're not buying American ketchup, like, we're buying Canadian ketchup, and it's becoming a thing. There are now Buy Canada campaigns where there are people who are boycotting American goods and products. Again, what impact this is going to have economically is almost piddling, but it's something that's happening locally, nationally now. I mean, my Facebook feed is now covered with people waving Canadian flags. Now, there's a contingent within Canada who are actually intrigued by the idea of becoming a 51st state. We can get into that if you want, but I think the vast majority of national unity is coalescing around Team Canada, screw those assholes, as you would expect it to coalesce in any other kind of crisis or emergency situation, which is how this is being perceived for us. This isn't just like, you're going to increase the price of, a car by X percent. Like, we are so economically interdependent with America that if they put on 25%, or God help us, worse, tariffs on us, that represents potentially major existential economic threats to us. That is a potential collapse in my quality of life and the quality of life of my neighbors, right? That's a collapse in the quality of my dollar, how much money what I can afford to buy globally. And because Canada is, we're a winter country. We don't produce produce. You know what I mean? Like, it's a lot of our food comes from America. So, if we try to do retaliatory tariffs in ways that impact the Americans, I think that our leadership so far has actually been reasonably intelligent in trying to do targeted retaliatory tariffs. So it's targeting goods and services that are designed to hurt specific Republicans in specific districts. So, like, bourbon, for example, was a pretty classic example of a retaliatory tariff. Bourbon isn't, like, no one's going to go broke on bourbon, But if those retaliatory tariffs escalate or potentially get worse, or if we just start to see the economic viability of Canada decline over time because these tariffs become prolonged, like we potentially see, for example, investment not come here because they want to avoid tariffs by taking investment to the United States, or investment flees Canada for a lot of different reasons. I mean, that's the ball game for us, right?
Does anyone have a strategy, Jen?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think the first couple of months after Trump was elected, there was a real vacuum of moral and strategic leadership from the federal government. And as a result of that, you saw each of the individual provinces try to do their best by adopting their own individual strategies for coping. So,
and sorry, can you just jump in and give us a sense of the political persuasion of the provinces? Are there any that are long-term conservative provinces and long-term?
Yeah, so I'm in Alberta, right? And Alberta is considered
province.
It's an oil province. So it's a more conservative province relative to Canada. You have Ontario, which is where the bulk of the population is and a huge amount of the economic center, and it kind of goes left and right, but it's a bit more of a centrist province. You've got BC, which is a bit more West Coast style. So West Coast tends to be a bit more lefty progressive, or more experimental lefty progressive. You have the Atlantic provinces, which have a tendency to kind of vote liberal, but they're sort of pragmatic, centrist liberal. And then the prairie provinces can kind of go which way or that, depending on any kind of number of economic or political conditions, right?
Got it. So their responses to
Trump's so I mean, in my province, we had Danielle Smith, who's the premier of Alberta. And also remember that Alberta is hugely dependent on our oil exports, and our oil exports are intimately tied into Americans' oil and energy infrastructure. So if America were to cut off our oil tomorrow, we'd be borked. And I mean that very significantly borked. It makes up a significant aspect of Alberta's GDP. A huge chunk of our provincial budget comes directly from oil royalty revenues, resource referencing revenues. So like our ability to fund our healthcare system, and our education system rests on our ability to sell our oil to the Americans. And by the way,
it's probably worth just noting that, I mean, I've seen some sort of bombastic nationalist Canadian memes going around when the initial tariff threat was made that were like, well, if Trump wants to mess around with us, doesn't he realize like how much of Americans' natural resources come across the border from Canada? And we send them this much of this and this much of this. And I kept thinking, yeah, but if you stop selling it to them, then you also don't make any money.
Well, and also it's worse than that, because if we were to shut down the oil going south, firstly, that does two things. But the other thing is it invites America to retaliate by shutting natural gas going north. And if you look at a map of how integrated the energy markets are, and I don't know how nerdy you want me to get here, but imagine a giant loop, right? So the oil and the gas in Canada doesn't, I mean, there are some pathways, but it doesn't really go east-west, because that's not the economically viable route. What's happened is the oil's gone north-south. Mm-hmm. So our energy infrastructure is all tied in a kind of a very complicated north-south loop, where a lot of Canadian oil and crude gets sold into the American market at a significant discount to global prices, because Canada's proven unable to build the infrastructure required to sell our product internationally. That's a whole other conversation, let me tell you. But anyway, as a result, we're landlocked into the American energy infrastructure. We sell our oil and our crude to Americans at a significant discount to global markets. The Americans refine it in kind of mega refineries that are specially equipped to handle our kind of low quality crude. And then they either sell it internally to themselves on the domestic market, or they'll sell it on the world market, depending on where the world market prices are. So what those hyper patriots don't quite realize is that, yeah, we could potentially cut them off going south. Then there's nowhere else for the oil to go, guys. We cut ourselves out, we landlock ourselves. But then also what they also don't realize is that if America were to cut off natural gas supplies going north, hope you enjoy heating your house without natural gas in winter. This is not a problem that you have in Australia all that much.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, it gets real cold. Real cold
I've spent some winter time in Calgary and Toronto. You don't want to be without gas.
Where I would live would be fine. I live in the gas and oil producing regions, and we would probably be fine. But we can't ship enough natural gas east-west to heat central Canada. The pipelines aren't there, and we don't have enough trucks and roads to do it. So and also
in other words, you can't escalate. Like escalation is off the table.
We
There's
can
no way to. to
Well,
win
we
that
can
game?
escalate. There are things that we can do to escalate to hurt the Americans. Absolutely. But the problem is that we're still dealing with an interdependent economic situation with a group of people who are richer and larger than us by a factor of 10 to 100, depending on how you want to calculate it. So we would need to escalate 10 times more than anything they did to us for them to even feel an impact. And the American economic situation is so much more wealthy, so much more powerful, has so much more access, so much more dynamic and innovative than ours is, so much more productive, that they would just adapt. And the other thing that I think a lot of the people who want to shut off the oil aren't factoring in here is that if Canada shuts off the oil and we become an unreliable source of crude to the American refineries down south, and they have to put in the $100 billion investment that would be required to rejig their own internal infrastructure, would that hurt them for a year or two, maybe 5? Yes. And once they made those infrastructures and those plays, we're cut out potentially forever. And can we throw $100 billion around to rejig our entire energy infrastructure? Not as easily as the Americans can. There's just way more money down there, right? So we're in this really uniquely vulnerable situation on the energy side. We're in a uniquely vulnerable situation on goods and services. And we're in a very particularly vulnerable situation in terms of auto parts and car manufacturing. And the other thing that people don't realize is that the American and Canadian auto sector has essentially become integrated. So car parts will pass over the border multiple times, like dozens of times, in order to create a full size car, because we just treat this as like a
single market.
Yeah, we treat it essentially like a single market. So when America starts tariffing auto parts and making it too expensive, all the margins of the car parts companies or the car companies begin to collapse, right? So they have to start now onshoring. And I mean, onshoring is even the wrong word, because it's not even like there's not a shore. It's the same goddamn shore.
Yeah.
But if they have to onshore all of their auto parts creations, yes, that potentially does increase investment in American auto sector and auto parts. But
isn't all of this going to be a massive headache for American car companies as well? And aren't they going to start pushing back against Trump and going, dude, this is not feasible. This isn't workable.
But none of Trump's policies are fundamentally rooted in economics. They're rooted in perception and emotion. So what's he like? He doesn't care. What does he care?
Well, it depends what the Dow does, I suppose.
Well, but I mean, ultimately, this is the thing that really got me, because I was listening to the Trump address the Joint Chiefs. I mean, it was one misleading comment after one misleading comment after one misleading comment after one lie after another. He's crafting his own reality. So if Trump says your economic situation is better than it was 5 years ago under that terrible Joe Biden, the people who matter to him will just believe it.
Well, he's been in office for 3 seconds, and so they'll believe it until their wallets tell them that they can't believe it anymore, until their 401k
I'm not sure that's even true. I'm not even sure that's true. I think that this guy is a remarkably competent marketer. I think he's very good at crafting perceptions of reality.
Well, that's certainly true. But I mean, at some point, there's only so much marketing you can do before new Coke or whatever the stupid product that you've developed is.
This is a temporary pain. This is temporary pain. Everything will get better in the long run if you just do what I tell you. This is just a temporary headache. It's okay. It'll hurt in the short term. But or maybe your wallet's worse off. But believe me, and as a whole, the American people are better off. Look at all these jobs we've brought back from Ontario. We've brought back 20,000 more jobs from Ontario. The Rust Belt is thriving. And of course, most people are never going to drive through the Rust Belt to decide for themselves how it's thriving or not. He's crafting his own reality. He's crafting his own perception of reality.
Yes.
That's what he's doing. So I'm not even this is where I get really pessimistic, because I'm not convinced that people are rational actors, rational economic actors. I'm not convinced that they're going to respond to a significant decline in their quality of life appropriately. I think they're going to listen to this guy telling everyone that I think they're going to, a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people are going to listen to Donald Trump insisting that life is better now, and they're going to accept it regardless of what the empirical or objective data of their wallets tell them.
Some people will. That fraction of his base will get smaller and smaller depending on how dire the circumstances in their lives get. The true believers will be left, of course, but
maybe
we're 6 weeks in, Jen. Hold out some hope for eventually. Reality at the beginning of every administration. The president gets to call the shots because the president is the person who's in charge, and they get to dictate everything. But eventually things happen. Terrorist attacks happen, pandemics happen, national security, unexpected things happen. The shit hits the fan somehow. And eventually, after months or years, they own it. They have to own it.
Okay, but you got to remember here, it's March. I'm living in Canada. It's really bleak right now. I'm sad.
I'm speaking to you from sunny summer in Australia with my glossy sheen, my rose-tinted spectacles.
Yes, but on the plus side, we don't have the terrible animals and bugs that
That's
you have.
true.
Like
this is true.
The frigid expanse of death manages to kill everything that wants to kill us. And
Jen,
this is the kind of sterility that I'm looking for in my climate. But
my seven-year-old son for Christmas literally got a snake, Jen. So I live with a python. So you don't need to tell me.
But at least it's in a cage.
It's in a cage, yeah. Although it escaped its cage. It escaped its cage a few weeks ago.
Look, all I hear is that you can't bring food to the beach in Australia because of the bugs in the sand, and that freaked me right the hell out.
Actually, not terrible. In comparison to Canadian summers, I got to say one of the worst bug experiences I've ever had was going camping and hiking in BC in the middle of summer. The mosquitoes, unbelievable.
Don't make this worse for me, Josh. I'm already in a bad enough place, okay? Don't make this worse for me. I'm hoping that the Trump phenomenon is a reactionary backlash to a unique moment in history, and that the fever dream breaks and we all go back to normal, whatever normal looks like after this. But what I'm also perceiving as a Canadian is, okay, but what if we don't?
Sure. To clarify, my claim isn't that the fever will break and we'll all go back to normal. My claim is just that he's going to run into an increasingly difficult. Yeah, that's right. And the briar patch is going to take us somewhere different than where he thinks he's going. I'm not saying that everything will be hunky dory, but it's not going to go the way that he wants it to.
Or he gets replaced with JD Vance, who's worse. And what we're seeing here right now is the beginning of a medium to long-term trend in the way that America wants to go and how it wants to govern itself. And if it wants to become a much more insular and protectionist, oligarchic, arguably autocratic state, is that if that's the direction that it wants to go, in which case, poor little Canada over here is like, a moth in a cage with a gorilla. And what do we do? How do we respond to that? Right? I think the only answer for us is we have to hope for the best, but assume the worst. We have to operate under the assumption that this is the direction that America wants to go in. And the only way that we can credibly respond to that is to make ourselves as innovative, productive, and economically resilient as possible, so that whatever America chooses to do, we don't have to necessarily become a slave to it.
Yeah.
Right? I just think that's our only response here. That's our only play.
Yeah. To be honest, you probably do something akin to what Australia has had to do as a result of just being located where Australia is, which is you get more innovative about long supply chains, and you pivot to Asia, and you sell a lot more stuff to China, and you knit yourselves together with Europe more closely, and you become an independent. You've got everything going for you: an educated population, lots of resources. There's no reason why you can't be rich without the United States.
Don't get me started about the issues we're having in Canada. There are significant cultural and economic problems we have here with sclerosis, lack of ability to build things, lack of ability to function appropriately, lack of ability to move quickly. Like, we have problems that this crisis is going to force us to confront.
Right.
I have concerns. But you're right. If you're playing the video game, if you're playing Civilization, you want to play Canada.
Absolutely.
Right? To start,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
This is the place to begin. In theory. In practice, I really do think that Canada's squandered every advantage that we've had, and we've allowed ourselves to become slow-moving, fat, and complacent. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, we've had the luxury of sitting next to the world's biggest, most powerful, most economically resilient superpower for generations now.
Okay, let's talk about Canada then instead of Donald Trump. But let's talk about the elections this weekend. So what exactly is happening? Just to take us through, remind us, those of us who've only paid scant attention to the elections and the demise of Prime Minister Trudeau. What's going on?
Oh, God. Well, we're not talking literal demise, I do hope. But, no. God, where do I even begin with that?
So just logistically, just explain what the party is doing this weekend and who the candidates are, I guess.
The straight top line.
Straight top,
okay. Yeah. So essentially Justin Trudeau finally decided that he needed to resign. He resigned at a fairly late juncture in terms of our needs to fund Parliament and also deal with the trade war that we're now in with Donald Trump. And I can get into the nitty gritty of that if you like. After he resigned, essentially technically five, but four people have credible people have stepped forward as a potential replacement to him. One of them is obviously Mark Carney, who is both the former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor. Very impressive, very credible, albeit sort of elite CB, so to speak. Other one is Chrystia Freeland, who was both Justin Trudeau's key second-hand woman, right-hand woman for the entirety of his governmental tenure. For a while, she was nicknamed like the Minister of Everything because she seemed to be the only competent person in his cabinet, and as a result, wound up doing almost every ministry.
She was the foreign minister, wasn't she?
Foreign minister, a finance minister, deputy minister. She's literally the minister. I'm not going to waste your time listing all the things she was the head of. She's an interesting character. We can get into her. There's Karina Gold and there's Frank Baylis. Now, these are kind of fringe figures who are probably running in order to increase their own profile and their own stature in a future government because they're not really the most. They don't have the profile required to replace Trudeau.
Okay. So and who votes on the weekend?
Okay, so the people who are voting on the weekend are members of the Liberal Party. You could sign up for the Liberal Party basically by going to the Liberal website. You sign up, you put thing, and has been some verification that these are people who are of age citizens, although I think it's going to be debatable as to whether or not enough verification's been done, but that's a whole other side conversation. Essentially, Liberal Party members are deciding who to replace Justin Trudeau with.
And is that a large proportion of the electorate the way it is in the United States, or is it tiny like it is in other?
It's not tiny. My guess is that it will be in the hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
So no, it will be a sizable chunk of the of people.
Okay, so that's basically a primary. And when is the federal election?
Well, don't get me started about like Canada's weird attempts to hybridize its political system between the UK Westminster parliamentary system and the American primary system, because it's not going great. Let me just tell you. But stick with Westminster parliamentary, guys. Don't try and like democratize it.
Do you have fixed terms at a national level, or is it can the Prime Minister announce that?
Kind of yes, but kind of no. And this is the great thing about the Canadian system is that it's totally opaque and no one can follow it unless they live here. So there are constitutional limits on how long a term can go. There are also legislative limits on how long a term can go. And also because it's a Westminster parliamentary system, as in the Australian system, if the governing party loses the confidence of Parliament, an election is called automatically. So what's probably going to happen is it's probably going to be a Mark Carney victory. And the rumor has it right now that Carney is going to call a snap election, which means we're probably going to be calling an election in the midst of a trade war with America, which is just awesome for us. It's great.
Right. And just to clarify, so normally it would be normal for the Prime Minister to call an election anyway, but he would call one earlier than might have been expected. Because in Australia and the UK, I think also there's like a 9-month window in which the government can call an election and they just do it whenever they want to.
Yes, sort of no. So, I mean, if we were going by the legislative limits, we would be expecting an October election. So the October of this year is sort of when we would be expecting to call it. And I think they would have to pass legislation in order to push it further than that. But I don't think that's realistic. So normally we were expecting an October election. But what's happening now is that the reason why Trudeau essentially had to resign is because back in December, Chrystia Freeland, I mentioned her, she resigned from cabinet basically saying this should be bananas after about more than a year and a half of sort of tanking poll numbers for Trudeau. Trudeau's become personally very, very unpopular.
And why is that?
Where do I start? I don't even know how to start. Like,
so
look,
let me give you
the short answer on this one is that, like, essentially the short answer on this one is like, look, he's been prime minister for 9 years. Canadians get sick of their leaders after about 9 years. We're just done. It's stale. Who doesn't? We're tired of seeing this guy. We're tired of his face and we're tired of his voice. Okay, it's time for someone new. So that's the short answer, but I can get into greater detail later. So anyway, December, Chrystia Freeland quits, says, "This is bananas. I'm out. I'm outie." Poll numbers are absolutely tanking. The Liberals look like they're absolutely ready for a shellacking. And in the meantime, we've got a very, very chippy Conservative leader who's like 20 points ahead of the Liberals in the polls and has been trying to challenge the current government with confidence motion after confidence motion after confidence motion that have only succeeded because the Liberals have managed to have like a very narrow coalition with the NDP, with the New Democratic Party, which is kind of like a socialist party. But the New Democratic Party said that they were going to rip up their confidence and supply agreement like way back in September, even though they're still voting with the government on the last couple of confidence motions. Don't get me started. It's a whole big mess.
This is all a bit arcane for Americans, but it basically means that the opposition is challenging, is forcing parliamentarians to vote in favor of the government, and the minority coalition partner, the Socialist Party, is threatening to stop funding for normal government affairs. Is that right? What it means to stop supply?
Okay, here we go. Let's go back. Do you want me to get into it? Do you want me to get into it?
In your face that this is not
the death. The death inside.
Yeah,
no. I can go there and make it interesting.
Do not go here. Okay.
I can go there and I can make this interesting if you want.
Yes.
But essentially, in 2019, the Liberals won with, it wasn't even 2019.
I've got literally a stopwatch to give you the number of seconds to make it interesting.
Okay. In the last election, the Liberals only won a minority government, which means the only way that they could manage to maintain the confidence of the House, which was with the coalition with the NDP, which means they needed to create something called a confidence and supply agreement. So the NDP agrees to prop up the Liberals with a majority on confidence motions in exchange for little like goodies on the side. In September, the leader of the NDP comes out and says, "We're ripping up the supply agreement. We're no longer voting with the government."
And supply basically means the supply of government for the government to function. The supply of money.
Correct.
Money.
That's right. And if you can't supply the government with money, you lose the confidence of the House and you have to go into an election, right? So the NDP leader says, "No, we're not doing this anymore." The Conservative says, "So does that mean you're going to vote against the government and you're going to vote for an election?" And the leader of the NDP is like, "Yeah, not really." So the Conservatives have been playing this game where they've been running confidence motion after confidence motion after confidence motion, trying to force the NDP to vote against their coalition partner.
Got it. Trying to break the coalition, which the governing party needs because they don't have enough seats to rule in their own right.
Exactly, that's right. So what's happened after multiples of these votes, and it's all been just it made Parliament into a bit of a disaster where nothing was really getting done. There's a whole bunch of other side quests in this whole drama, but as a result of this ratcheted up the pressure on the Liberals who were continuing to tank in the polls. Finally, you've got Chrystia Freeland that says, "This is bananas. I'm out. I'm quitting." Trudeau's like, "I'm going to think about my future." He goes on a ski holiday, comes back from vacation, and then says, "I guess I'll be resigning then," which was a bit of a weird strategic and catastrophic mistake for reasons that I can get into. But essentially, it pushed Trudeau to finally admit that he was not going to be the guy who was going to be taking the Liberals into the next election.
Why is that a mistake? I would have thought that if you can see the writing on the wall and you think you're going to lose an election, you would want to bow out before you take the party to catastrophe.
Well, because what was happening is that the Conservatives over that ski holiday said, "We're going to pass another confidence vote motion in a committee meeting," which means that when Parliament was supposed to come back on January 22nd, they were going to have a confidence motion for the government to vote on right away. And this was after the NDP partner coalition said, "We're not voting with the government on a confidence motion again." So essentially, they were going to force the government to fall in January. And so Trudeau, rather than face the music and allow the government to fall and then go into an election honorably and to go down with his ship, so to speak, he said, "Screw that. I'm going to prorogue Parliament." So he went to the Governor General, said, "Stall out all operations of government, lock the doors, and I'm going to quit, and then that will give my party a couple of weeks to try and select a new leader, and that they can bring back Parliament with a new leader."
Okay.
Now, proroguing Parliament...
I'll just like say there is an alternative interpretation of Trudeau's actions where you're being critical of him for not going down with the ship, but a Trudeau supporter would presumably say, don't drag the party to an electoral defeat. Like, be a man, get out, say goodbye, I've done my bit, hand it over to somebody else and see if they can do a better job.
Well, I suppose that, I guess, maybe that will work out for them in the long run. But I think the problem that I have with it is not that the Trudeau is resigning. I think that Trudeau has every right to resign. I think he should have seen the writing on the wall and resigned back in September and given his party an actual credible period of time to run a proper leadership. Because what it says in the Liberal Party's own internal party constitution is that leadership races have to be 90 days long. But Trudeau only actually gave his party something like 70 days to run a leadership between his proroguing Parliament and when Parliament needs to come back to pass the annual budget. So he didn't give his party enough time to run a really strong, credible leadership race.
Okay. Nonetheless, this happens all the time. Kamala Harris had 3 seconds before the election.
Yeah, well, and look at how well that worked out for Kamala Harris. No,
I get it.
Meanwhile, this is all happening in the midst of a potentially existential economic crisis, in the midst of a trade war. So Parliament's locked. We have no ability to actually to do certain types of actions, like we can do some sorts of retaliatory tariffs on using orders of council and things like that. But we're not. Parliament's not sitting. There's the actual leadership vacuum and void is total, because we're now in the midst of a Liberal leadership race that is consuming all of the domestic air in the room. And it's not clear that even if the Americans could negotiate with us, who the hell is there to negotiate with? We don't even know who the next leader of the prime minister's, or the next prime minister's going to be. Just
to clarify, Jen, when this leadership race is over this weekend, next week, does that person become the prime minister until the next election?
That person becomes the prime minister, even though that person might be Mark Carney. So he hasn't won an election to have a seat in Parliament. So he'll become prime minister of the party, but he won't be sitting in Parliament.
How can that happen? You can't have a prime minister who's not in the House of Commons.
Yes, you kind of can, I guess. Everyone's doing this by the seat of their pants, right? So
has this never happened before?
I don't know offhand. I should know that offhand, but it's not. He can become prime minister. He can certainly become leader of the party. He will be treated effectively as prime minister. Normally, what would happen in this kind of situation is you'd have him run in a basically an instant by-election. The party would call a by-election in some kind of seat. The guy would run in a by-election, and then he'd win it would be in a safe Liberal seat that he would then be able to just take it out. That's normally how you
I think that would have to happen legally in Australia. I don't think you can. I don't think the party can elect a leader who's not a parliamentarian.
Yeah, well, apparently Canada's just making it up as we go along. So anyway,
theoretically, if Carney becomes PM next week, or Chrystia Freeland, then they could call a snap election, and then the election could take place in 6 weeks' time, and they would have been prime minister for just 6 weeks without having had a parliamentary seat.
No, because the second you call the election, you're no longer prime minister.
Oh, I see.
So like it could
would they be listed? Like, would he be listed on a list of Canadian prime ministers if he was prime minister for 24 hours before calling the election?
They'd have to make the portrait and everything. Like, they'd have to paint the portrait and put him in the hall. So like even if he's
even ever running for parliament.
I think so.
Loopy.
Yeah. It's pretty wild.
And
this is chaos upon chaos upon chaos in the midst of a really chaotic moment. And like, my criticism of Trudeau is not that he stepped down. It's that the writing was on the wall for Trudeau for the last year and a half. And if he had, he's now survived multiple attempted spills that didn't go anywhere, multiple attempted caucus coups. It should have been obvious to him, I would think, of June of last year, that he needed to step down and go and run a credible replacement campaign. Even September of last year would have been fine. Instead, he's doing this to maximize the chaos. And like, by the way, he's still prime minister.
Yeah.
He's resigned from the party, but he's still prime minister. You know, he's out there and he's announcing these huge
he's announced his resignation from the party, or he has resigned?
He's announced his future resignation.
Yes, right. So he's still the leader of the party. He's still the prime minister.
He's still the prime minister.
Yeah, but lame ducks happen all the time. Joe Biden was the president 6 weeks ago.
It's just really a bad time to be having a lame duck
Sure.
It's
Okay.
not the
So
greatest.
let's just talk the election then, just so that we get a
Okay.
snapshot of what we should how we should interpret things depending when we wake up next on Monday or on Sunday or whatever, and we see who the winner is. What should we understand if it's Carney versus Freeland? What does that mean that Liberal Party voters have made
it'll probably
decision-wise?
be Carney, and the reason why I'm saying that is because the fundraising totals have come out, and the situation is not as dire for Freeland as the initial totals were suggesting. Like, she's raised decent money, but Carney's so outstripped her in fundraising that it would be pretty impossible. It would be very unlikely for me. It's clear to me that was a clear indicator that the enthusiasm is for Carney, not for Freeland. So I'd be very shocked if it weren't Carney.
Enthusiasm in terms of small dollar donations, or enthusiasm in terms of big corporations going Carney is our guy?
No, there are our corporation, our funding limits are pretty strict.
Okay.
So no, I almost all this would be coming.
And what
from
do you think people are seeing in
corporations.
Carney that they're not seeing in Chrystia Freeland?
I think they're seeing he's portraying himself as the adult in the room who can manage a crisis. Right? I'm the head of the bank of whatever. I'm credible. It's calming technocratic daddy voice.
Right.
That's kind of the vibe that he's giving me. I have concerns that I'm not sure that he's got any more of a plan in terms of how to deal with the Trump situation than the Conservatives do. But he's got a much more impressive set of credentials and CVs.
And just to clarify the bank thing, the governor of the Reserve Bank in Canada and the UK would be the equivalent of the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the United States, right? So for American listeners, like, it's the chairman of the Fed. So he would have been in charge of interest rates.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So this is where he would have been.
So a steady pair of hands, someone who's an institutionalist, essentially. And then
absolutely,
how is he polling if he were in a head-to-head against the Conservatives for the general election?
I think the polls are really all over the map. There's definitely been a post-Trudeau bump for the Liberals generally. In fact, some polling suggested that, remember that the Conservatives have been ahead by like 20 plus points, 10 to 20 points for more than a year. Like, it's been a very, very strong lead. And there has been some suggestion that since since Trudeau left, remember Trudeau himself was personally very, very unpopular, that the Liberals are bumping up again. Now, even some polling suggesting that there was a bit of a honeymoon period after Trudeau left, that they are as high as the Conservatives, that they're now running a more competitive race. I don't think that's going to hold. I think that the Liberals have just been in power for a really long time, and I don't think that Carney is enough of a charismatic or enough of a transformational figure. I don't think he's distanced himself enough from the previous Trudeau government to be able to overcome some of the general fatigue that people have with this current government.
And
but
who's the Conservative leader, and how presidential is that person?
Oh, man. Okay. I'm going to need a sip of tea before I get into it. All right. All right.
I hope there's gin in the tea.
There might have to be. Okay. So Pierre Poilievre is the head of the Conservative Party. Pierre Poilievre has been in Canadian politics since he was like basically a 24-year-old. Okay, so the vibe that Pierre, do you have like something called like Young Conservatives in Australia?
Yeah, sure.
Like school groups that recruit and train up and coming young go-getters who have read their first Ayn Rand novel.
Yeah,
you know
they wear bow ties. They've got the
they wear bow ties. They like to do they like to do debates, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that is Pierre. That's who he is. He's the young conservative. He's been in politics. He actually, I think, won his first election at 24, I think. And he has been a lifelong parliamentarian who has finally honed his ability to operate within the Canadian political system to a very fine degree. And I think that, do we need to get into internecine political sort of conservative infighting? Do we need to do that? Okay. So the Conservative Party, after Stephen Harper, you may recall Stephen Harper was a former prime minister, basically went through 10 years of vicious infighting and several leaders. And finally, Pierre Poilievre emerged with an argument that's like, we need to stop trying to win by being liberals. We need to win by being conservatives. However, conservatism is defined in a Canadian context. We need to be scrappy. We need to be plucky. We need to be willing to kill the sacred cows and, destroy our supply manage. No, anyway, no, we need to kill all of our sacred cows. We need to be more aggressive and assertive. We need to stop tiptoeing around what we believe. We need to not be ashamed of what we believe. We need to be conservatives. And because this guy came to his leadership at a moment when people were just absolutely exasperated by the liberals and everything they stood for, kind of on the tail end of like what I would call the woke or identitarian swing, he's coming in very much as a, oh, thank God, someone who just says what he thinks. You know, there's a bit of that. He's also, I would say, ironically, for someone who spent his entire life and career in the institution, his branding is sort of anti-institutional. So he has sort of a similar anti-elite, similar kind of populist branding. He operates, you know, he's very skeptical of the mainstream media. He's very critical of the mainstream media. He wants to defund the CBC. He wants to axe the carbon tax. He wants to talk about building homes for young Canadians. In fact, there's a real sort of YIMBY kind of vibes. He's younger than Trudeau. There's a bit of a let's build all the homes, let's be innovative, let's blah 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 blah. There's a lot of that, which I think is quite positive. I don't think that his attacks on the mainstream media are positive. I think there's that vibe of kind of taking some cues from Trump in that regard. And also, I mean, one of the things that I think really set people off about Pierre was, I don't know if you recall the convoy, the trucker convoys that happened a couple of years ago. This was big when we had anti-COVID protests that essentially shut down Ottawa and shut down many of our major borders with the United States. You know, Pierre went and kind of met with the convoyers and expressed kind of the tacit support for what they were doing. And I think that really set a lot of the institutionalists off by expressing, if not outright solidarity, then certainly sort of tacit support for those groups. So, you know, definitely it's being, the ironic thing is, you know, for Pierre to present himself as a populist is kind of funny because, of course, he was in Parliament he was a cabinet minister under the Harper government. You know what I mean? Like, he's been there for decades. But it is shaping up in the way that these two people are presenting themselves to be sort of Mark Carney, as I said, technocratic daddy voice, safe pair of hands, institutionalist, protector of the Canadian institutions, versus Pierre Poilievre, who's a much more radical vision of tearing stuff down and you know, Canada is broken. This isn't working anymore. We need to fix things.
It's so interesting, Jen, isn't it? Because it sounds like it's symptomatic of this strange shift that's happened between left and right over the past few decades, where, you know, the old buttoned-up institutionalists who were defending small c conservatism used to be the conservative side of politics, and the ones who wanted to change everything and, you know, throw sand in the gears and go out and party and, like, you know, shake everything up were on the left. And that's shifted. Switched.
And the other interesting thing that's switching, and I think you're seeing this in American politics, but you're seeing this in Canadian politics as well, is where blue collar labor is going. Right. So blue collar labor traditionally were associated with leftist politics in the Canadian system. But what I think has started to happen is as the left became more culturally alien to blue collar workers, and by that I mean they became more woke, if you prefer, or identitarian left, kind of, if you prefer, that was very alienating to a lot of blue collar Canadians. So you're finding there's now a realignment of blue collar Canadians around conservative values, small c conservative values. So we're seeing that shift happen in Canada quite strongly, which is why what you're also seeing with Pierre is an unwillingness to go after labor. Right? There's an alignment, particularly with private labor, which will be really, really interesting to see how that plays out, because, I mean, Canada's civil service has become enormously bloated and, frankly, not very effective. And one of the things that I actually expect a conservative leader to do is going to be taking the hatchet to it.
And is there any difference? Is there any difference between the parties on issues of social welfare and economic justice?
Inch wide, mile wide, inch deep.
Right.
You know, like I think that on the conservative side, you generally find that there's a much greater willingness to talk about, for example, private delivery of a public healthcare system. So this would be talking about reforming the existing Canadian healthcare system to allow certain private, for example, cataract surgeries or private hip surgeries to happen within a single payer system. So it's not an American style system. It's more of a, you're still paying your taxes, but then the administrative apparatus within the public system is going to contract out certain
Right,
services
but it's
to a
nothing
private
major.
sector.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
but that is major. Like that would be a major shift for. I mean, we do this in some provinces already. With more greater degree of success. So that is a pretty significant reform to a Canadian system. For a long time, the Canadian healthcare system was a very religious topic in Canada, and very, very resistant to any kind of reform or innovation on that side.
but what I mean by not major is it's hard to demonize. It's hard for the left to demonize as being something that's going to ruin the Canadian safety net.
No, it's not hard for them to demonize it. They can demonize it very effectively. I mean, the other thing I would say, the other big distinction between the two in terms of social welfare would be on drug policy. Real sharp divides on drug policy. In recent years, Canada's, particularly on the left, has adopted more harm reduction style policies. And we're starting to see a clawback of those policies, even in some of the provinces that embrace them most heavily, because they are being met with concurrent major issues with social disorder that haven't been effectively addressed. And so when you have conservatives coming together, they're saying harm reduction policies aren't working. We're going to take more of a rehabilitation style approach. So we're going to start funding more centers for treatment and rehabilitation. So that's kind of where the division lies. So it's not like you're not having conservatives come to power saying we're going to lock up everybody who's on drugs. You're having more conservatives coming forward with, we need to start treating and rehabilitating this, and not creating mechanisms for normalization of drug use.
Right.
And that's very starkly at odds with where the left's been on a lot of the drug policy issues. And this is particularly salient in places like Vancouver and British Columbia, where the drug abuse issues are pretty extreme.
And thinking about the way that the Conservatives are positioning themselves for the election this year, where are they on things like immigration and, when you think about the sort of populist rhetoric of the far right and make America great again, how do they relate to that and isolationism and like Ukraine and NATO and that grab bag of stuff?
One of the things that I get a little bit emotional about is that I think that Canada was one of the few countries that had long-lasting consensus on immigration is good. And we had a strong bipartisan consensus on immigration is good. And the reason why we did is because we were quite ruthless with our immigration system. We were, economic, points-based, fairly rational, very reasonable, and everybody was on board with, I don't care where you're coming from in the world. You come to Canada, you make a good life for yourself, you raise your family here, you're a Canadian as far as we're concerned. And we had a very positive, very healthy approach to that for a really long time. And what happened under the Liberal government is that in order to essentially backstop our declining per capita GDP, we started bringing in lots of people. We radically increased our immigration. I mean, I don't even think we know how many people have come in the last year, but it's over 1 million in a year in a country of 40 million. And what's also happened in the midst of all that is our housing and our infrastructure have been fundamentally unable to keep up. We can't build houses fast enough for the number of people we're taking in. And as a result, our housing prices are now completely bananas. Like you need $1 million to buy a house, a basic
This is
house.
all extremely familiar to Australians.
Well, yeah, you'll understand what we're talking about. But I mean, in America, they talk about the housing crisis in America and how housing prices are out of control. And I'm like, bitch,
yeah,
come here and talk to me about housing prices being out of control.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of economic reasons why that's happened. The house prices have been going up for a really long time, but everything has been hugely exacerbated by a really radical increase in immigration policy. And as a result, the bipartisan consensus that we had on immigration, I think it's not even that it's crushing, because the Liberals have sort of themselves admitted that this isn't working. Like the Liberals themselves are now walking back a lot of their immigration policies. Like they themselves have said, well, we can't continue to take people at this pace while we can't build houses. Like this is obviously a problem.
I mean, this is happening in the Labor Party in Australia and in the UK as well. Everyone's realizing that it's untenable.
Yeah, it's untenable, essentially, is the situation. So also remember that Canada's always had the luxury of being surrounded on all sides by oceans and a giant American border. So, and we had something called the first country agreement. Sorry, I'm butchering that. But, we haven't had the mass uncontrolled flows of immigration that America has had to deal with in the South. So it's been really easy for Northern Canadians to get smug about our welcomingness to immigration, because we don't have mass uncontrolled immigration on anything close to the scale that the Americans do. We just don't. And so we've been very smug about this. And then that smugness, I think, is starting to wear off as we're suddenly realizing that we've taken people in at a rate that we can't actually sustain just from a pure infrastructure point of view.
Right, but is that reassessment being conducted coolly, or is there histrionics and populist tub thumping?
I don't think there's a lot of histrionics on this. In fact, I think part of the reason why there's not a lot of histrionics on this is because even the Liberals themselves have kind of conceded the point at this point.
Right.
So like it's I don't think that I'm not seeing the Conservatives try to generate a lot of enthusiasm or hysteria on immigration specifically. The Conservatives have their own issues around positioning as a result of Donald Trump. That's its own kind of thing. But it's not.
Yes, let's just wrap up our analysis of the Conservatives with that. What is the relationship? Have the Canadian Conservatives been tanked as a result of them being associated with the right side of politics, which is now associated with Donald Trump and the attacks on Canada?
I think the Liberals would like them to be, definitely. But I think that the Conservatives have been very slow to pivot. The Conservatives have been slow to react appropriately to Donald Trump. They've been slow to take on the Team Canada, screw the Americans mantle. I don't think that's because they're necessarily pro Donald Trump or pro becoming the 51st state. Pierre Poilievre has been very emphatic about not wanting to become the 51st state and standing up. He's now kind of pivoting his whole future campaign to a Canada First campaign, which kind of rhymes with the America First campaign of Donald Trump, but is very clearly in opposition to Donald Trump, ironically, which is kind of interesting. But definitely the way that the Liberals are going to frame the Conservatives is these guys are just MAGA light. They're best buddies with Donald Trump. They'll sell Canada out in an instant. They can't be trusted to deal with Donald Trump or negotiate with him, which is a very effective positioning for them.
Right.
I don't think that is correct. I think that the Conservatives are just as patriotic as anybody else in Canada. But it's going to be really interesting to see how those different perspectives and narratives kind of position themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a very hard sell for a Conservative to say that nationalism does not mean that you side with the nationalist in the other country who's bullying you. It means that you become a nationalist for your own country.
That's right.
So you can both be right-wing nationalists if you want to. And, it's a zero-sum game, but it doesn't mean you're a traitor.
Well, exactly. But the problem that the Conservatives ran into is that they were expecting to run the next election on the carbon tax. Like, they're axe the tax. They had the T-shirts built up. They had the signs done. They were going to go in on axe the tax, baby. Like affordability issues, meat and butter stuff. And like all of a sudden we've got Donald Trump coming in being like, yeah, I'm going to take over your state. And like use economic force to plummet you into oblivion. And then you had like Pierre Poilievre for the longest time going, but axe the tax? Axe the tax?
We had such a good slogan.
We had T-shirts made. Like what's like I got into literally a yelling match with a Conservative MP about this like a couple of months ago. And it's like, you guys get that it's not the axe the tax election anymore, right? Yeah. Like we're facing an existential threat here.
When you say existential threat, Jen, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, look, the economics of the situation are potential. We have to rethink ourselves as a country in relation to our greatest friend, ally, neighbor. We have to think about what we're doing here, Bob. And we have to, I think, really radically ask ourselves the degree to which we've allowed ourselves to be defined by a social safety net that may no longer be sustainable. There are deep questions there. And then, of course, when everybody talks about the 51st state, they say, well, that'll never happen. I don't know, man. Donald Trump is still talking as if he's expecting that to happen. And I think that there are some real internal shatter points in the Canadian political scheme that, if everything were aligned in exactly the right way, could make us very vulnerable to something really radical happening. That concerns me. Like, that keeps me up at night. I'm being asked to, argue in a debate next month about whether or not Canada should become the 51st state. I'm taking the no position, which let me tell you, it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare for me to take the room pleasing position on any particular debate, but that's going to be a real shift.
I mean, who's on yes?
One. Well, I don't know yet, but there are people who are going to make the yes argument. There are kind of fringe people right now in Alberta who are going to go down to America and make the case for, we want to join we want to join you guys. I think that's crazy right now. I don't know why in the world you would trust these people who are in power in America right now. They're not good faith actors.
And why would you want to import all of America's problems? I mean, Canada might have problems, but it doesn't have problems on the scale, I don't think, of American democracy.
Different kinds of problems, right? I mean, that's a...
Yeah,
you know what? You're going to have to invite me back.
Okay. We're going to have to. Okay, we can have a follow-up after the election.
A follow-up after
I'm interested in the identity. You said at the beginning of this conversation, when you were saying, like, we can talk about wokeness, or like you called it identitarian leftist politics, and you said
I think it's a less emotional.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Term.
Yeah, I don't like.
And I'm also a Canadian. I want to be polite about it.
Although identitarian leftist politics does lack a certain catchiness and also an allusion to the cancellation hysteria. Like it doesn't sound as censorious. Like it doesn't quite, it's not about the fact that people were conceiving of themselves as identities. It's the fact that they insisted on their worldview being to the exclusion of all others, and that people should be fired and hounded from the public square.
And this all became legitimate tactics in a war for ideas, right?
Yes. So how much credence should we give to the claim that phenomenon, that what we're currently living through is just essentially a predictable backlash to that cultural wave from 2017 to 2022?
It is a backlash, but the problem with it is that it's a backlash that risks being worse than the thing that it was reacting to, right? That's my fundamental concern. I mean, we started the line, Matt and I, as a direct result of what was happening in our cultural institutions, that there was a sense of it's a hard thing to put words to, because a lot of it was actually kind of emotional, but there was a sense of closing in and self-censorship and fear that started to happen, especially for people who were kind of center right, and a sense of being booted unofficially out of established institutions. That was real. That was a real thing that occurred. And I think it probably occurred more strongly in places like Canada than in the United States, because we have much smaller cultural institutions and much fewer people who were much more inclined to that kind of politics and that argumentation. America is a much bigger place with more resilient institutions, I think, in a lot of ways.
And maybe there's a cultural tendency to be more conciliatory and conformist in Canada.
Yes, there is.
And in Australia, I think, as well.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. 100% there is. There's a higher degree of, I think that's correct. So as a result, I think that the woke stuff in a lot of ways was culturally more difficult in a place like Canada than it was in the United States. So I do think that that's real. And I think that people who are trying to say, well, the woke stuff was always just this fringe phenomenon by a handful of people who never had any power, and the right is using that to weaponize their authoritarian march, I think those people are not being honest with themselves. I think that that's gaslighting. I don't think that's true. But the problem is that the way that the right, broadly speaking, is reacting to that backlash risks being 10 times more censorial, 10 times more liberal, and 10 times more dangerous than the woke phenomenon. I'm using that term in quotes. The woke phenomenon was at its peak. And I think that the onus is going to be on, sensible people who oppose the liberalism of that ascendant progressive movement to also demonstrate a commitment to those liberal ideals now that this pendulum is swinging in the opposite direction, and to not allow yourselves to get sucked up into the desire for revenge, or to get sucked up in a desire to, well, they would do this to us, so therefore we're going to do it 10 times harder to you. Now that the political and cultural power is swinging in a favorable direction for us, we have to be much more willing to call out our own side and say, you guys have lost the goddamn plot. than we were to call out the opposite. And I think that that is going to be the test of moral character and the test of people like me going forward. Like, right.
How do you feel about the accusation that those of us who were focused on the illiberal excesses of the left during the social justice awakening are somehow responsible for the current moment of populism by having joined in a chorus of condemnation that ended up ballooning into this?
Yeah, but that's
beast?
just a way of that's just a way of deflecting their own responsibility, right? They don't want to take responsibility for their own illiberalism, so they're going to deflect it upon the people who are calling out their liberalism. No, like that's I don't accept that.
Well, I suppose I'm talking about.
But what was the answer? So people were just supposed to go along with the illiberalism of the left indefinitely in order to prevent the illiberalism of the right? No, you call out illiberalism whether or not it's coming from the left or the right. That's the purpose of the exercise.
Yeah.
You call out illiberalism regardless of what tribe it's coming from.
I think their sense is that we made too big a deal out of it and thereby gave fuel to a moral panic that turned into Trumpism.
Yeah, well, I'm writing a book about moral panics, so let me tell you that moral panics are never one-sided. They participated in the moral panic as well. That was the crux of the argument that I think people like you and me were making. Years ago, at least in Canada, you and I were saying, guys, you can't use tactics on your ideological enemies that you don't want used against you. Because the second you normalize the tactics against your ideological enemies, they will be used against you. So you cannot do that. And I'm going to continue to make that argument to the people on the assholes on the right who try to use that for exactly the same reasons. Like, you have to preserve some guardrails of liberal normality, of civic society. And you have to preserve these guardrails regardless of who's trying to abuse them, right? Like, to do anything else is to allow your society to devolve into a pure will to power tribalism in which it's just the argument of all against all, and whomever has the most money and the most power wins at suppressing the side they don't like. That's not a society I want to live in. That's not a good outcome. It's like that. No, I'm going to fight for a third path here. And the third path I'm going to fight for is a small L liberal democratic society in which ideas can be contested and where it is okay to contest ideas. And I have full faith that batshit crazy and absurd autocracy that we're now seeing foment on the right of the United States can and will be challenged in that arena of ideas, and it will not succeed in the long run. That doesn't mean that we're not in for a really nasty 10 years. I think we are. I'm not optimistic about what the next 10 years are going to bring for us, but I don't think that the answer lies with K-hold losers on the right, and I don't think the answer lies with perpetually giving the liberalism of the left a pass because it's well-intentioned.
Yep. I often say that, like, when the current populist right-wing moment falls apart, we have to be ready not just with resistance, but with an alternative. And that alternative ought to not be yet more another swing as far back in the opposite direction as we just saw.
Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice?
Would be nice.
Wouldn't that be nice if we could just have something resembling an idea, going back to the idea that, like, opinions and people are nuanced and people can have disagreeing points of view, and we hash things out and like civilized human beings without resorting to stupid nonsense. Wouldn't that be great if we could just go back to that?
Here's to a future in which reasonable, sensible people like Canadians and Australians and, I don't know, like the Scots and maybe the Belgians all get together.
Rule the world again.
There we go. With sensible, centrist policies. Jen, thank you for explaining everything to us. It's fascinating to talk to you and lovely to meet you. Good luck this weekend, whichever way it goes, and good luck in the election.
Well, I don't wish me luck. I'm not running. I just
Good luck for your nation and your countrymen.
yeah, I just write stuff, man. That's all I do.
Well, thanks for explaining it to us.
Thank you.